Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today in this video I'm going to go over everything related to asynchronous programming in JavaScript. So I will start by talking about promises, and then I will transition into talking about the async await keywords that you can use in JavaScript, and I will explain everything as I would like to have been explained to me when I was a beginner. So before we get into the video, this video is sponsored by Letter, which is an amazing company, which I will talk a little bit about it right now. As many of you guys know, I am currently an undergrad student at a university, and I honestly find it really hard to find a job or just career advices on websites like LinkedIn. And for that reason, I am excited to tell you guys about Letter, which is a platform that is designed for students just like me. Honestly, it is an amazing platform where you can just share your struggles or your success stories, and if you want to, you can also just post anonymously. There's also a job board, which is really awesome because people can just share different job opportunities that they found so that other people can apply as well. Or maybe you can just use the platform to promote yourself to recruiters by putting your resume, putting information about you, and just talking to different people from the industry. And Letter is an application-based platform, so it is very simple and easy. You can just go to the platform, apply for it, and I'll be posting there as well. There are several communities that you can engage with, and if you want to check it out, I'll have a link for the website in the description. Okay everyone, so let's start with the tutorial. You can see that I just have a very simple application over here. It is a NodeJS application, but JavaScript runs equally everywhere. So I'm just going to run this in my terminal. And you can see that when I run an application like this, it should actually just console log. So if I do something like node index.js, it console logs hey, right? And it would happen the exact same thing if I did it on the browser as well. Now, why did I bring this up? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that normal JavaScript, without using promises or async await, just JavaScript that you write in general, runs almost like instantly, right? So if I console log this over here, and I actually have a variable over here, let's create a variable called name, and set it equal to something like Pedro, right? And I want to console log Pedro over here, or name over here, you should see that it should console log Pedro because it is almost like instantly, right? We are creating a variable, it recognizes it, and it console logs the value of it. And if I change the name to be equal to something like John, and I console log it again by saying console.log, and I console log name again, you should see that it will change the value, and the console log will satisfy that new value because changing the value for a variable is instant. In algorithmic, like if you think about it in computing time and thinking about how long it takes for an action like changing the value of a variable in your computer system, it is instant. So that's the reason why when we console log the new value, it actually console logs the new value and it doesn't take any time to change the value of name. Now, this isn't the case for every application. The reason for that is because if you've ever worked with a front-end application where you need to, fetch some data from an API, you might know that not all API requests take the exact same amount of time. And that makes sense. It depends on many factors. It depends on your internet speed. It depends on just how far away are you from the server. It depends on how big the request is. It depends on a lot of stuff. So for that reason, if I were to do something like, let's imagine we have an API and I want to fetch data related to a list of movies. And I created something like list of movies, and I just set this to be equal to fetch, and I fetched some data. Imagine that this is a URL. It's obviously not a URL, but imagine it is. And I'm fetching data from this API over here. Now, if I came over here and said console.log list of movies, this would probably not work. And the reason for that is because when you fetch this data, right, it's going to take a little bit more time. It's going to take maybe 500 milliseconds, maybe 1 second, maybe something, but it's not instant. We know that because you're fetching data from a server, and that takes time. And for that reason, when you console log this over here, the data that is over here isn't going to be the data that it actually fetched from the API. Because what JavaScript will see over here is it will see that you're fetching some data and setting it equal to a variable, but it's not actually like telling the program to wait for this request to be done to then continue moving forward with whatever you wrote over here and console log the list of movies. So for that reason, many languages deal with this in different ways. The first proposed idea to fix this in JavaScript, I believe, was using promises. Okay guys, so as you can see over here, I just wrote this example over here, and I'll go over exactly what it means. But basically, a promise, it's almost like an object in JavaScript. It is something that is pre-built in JavaScript, and it deals with stuff like waiting for data to be done. But on its core, you don't really need to do it that way. So a promise, as it is in JavaScript, it's just a class that you can invoke, as you can see over here. I created a variable called event, and this will be our promise. And when you set it equal to a new promise, basically it will take in a function which can have two arguments to it. The first argument is a resolve, and the second argument is reject. Then inside of this function, you can write some sort of logic that will define this promise. And by the way, if you're starting to get a little bit confused, don't worry. I'm just showing you the core idea of a promise initially, but then it will become a lot clearer as we go on with examples of how we actually use promise, because most of the time we won't be creating our own promises. We'll just be using promises that are returned, and we're going to deal with them. So what exactly does this do? Well, resolve and reject are two things that we really need to take into account. Resolve is just a function that we called when we want success to happen, right? When we want something, we want to say like, okay, if some condition is true, we want to resolve this promise, and we want to return some sort of value, or we want to deal with some sort of success part of our function, right? And reject, by the name, you know what it means. It is failure, right? When you want the function, the promise to fail, when you want some sort of error to occur, you call the reject function. So in the example that I created over here, it is pretty dumb, but it's pretty simple. I created a variable called name, and I set it equal to Pedro. And I just asked, if name is equal to Pedro, then call the resolve function, and if it is not, call the reject function. Now, how do we know what is the resolve function and what is the reject function? This is kind of how we're dealing with errors, right? If name is equal to Pedro, do something related to this promise being a success, and if it's not, do something related to it being an error. So error handle inside of this reject function. But how do we determine what the resolve and what the reject functions are? Well, we just come over here. We grab our promise, which in our case is called event, and every promise that exists in JavaScript contains something called a dot then and a dot catch, like this. Now, what exactly are the dot then and the dot catch? Well, the dot then is a function that will be called if we resolved, and a dot catch will be called if we're rejected. Now, think about it this way. Over here, if I want to say like, okay, name is equal to Pedro, what do I want to do if this is true? Well, I can create a function inside of this dot then, and I can just console log the name, right? Technically, I can just come here and say Pedro, but one thing you can do is you can pass arguments to this. So for example, in the resolve function, I want to pass the name, which will be Pedro, and I can grab that inside of here, and I can just console log name. Now, if there is any errors, I want to catch it. It's almost like a try catch. So right now, I'll just say error over here, and we can console log the error. We're not passing any error inside of this reject because we didn't over here. But what I can do is I can pass a message saying something like name was not Pedro. Name was, and then I just passed the name over here. Which right now, this won't happen because name is equal to Pedro. Now, what exactly should happen if we run this application? Well, let's see it. If I open up my console over here and I clear everything out and I just run node index.js, you should see that it console logged Pedro. Despite us not having any console logs like outside of this promise, it recognizes that the name is equal to Pedro. It resolves the function, passes the name into it, and when we define what the success and the error functions of this promise will be, we say that we want to console log it. But if I came over here and I said that the name is, I don't know, John, you should see that if I try to run this again, it should actually say name was not Pedro, name was John. And this is kind of the idea of promises. But one important thing to understand is that the main aspect of promises that you will be working with is this over here. Because what happens when you make an API request is you can say like, okay, if the API request is done, if the data has been received, then we want to do something. And if there was any errors in the request, then we want to catch that errors over here, that specific error over here. So this is what we'll be using most of our time. And there's also something else, which is the finally case, which you can also just put it over here like this. Finally is just something that will be called no matter if it was an error or if it was a success. So I'll just say promise finished or something like this. And when I run this again, it doesn't matter if name is equal to Pedro or not, it will say promise finished. If I change this back to Pedro, you should see that the finally case will again be console logged and will be called. Now, how do we apply this to actually fetching data? How do we make it so that this will work with fetching data? Well, I'm going to come up with an example over here, actually use an API, and I'll be back in a second. Okay, everyone. So as you can see, I came up with a very simple example over here using an actual API that exists. And if you want, here's the link for the API. All it does is it returns a list of facts about cats. So it's a very simple example, but I wanted to use this in order to show you guys how promises work when working with fetching data. Now, you can fetch data in many ways, and I do have videos where I teach you guys the different ways of how to fetch data from an API. The way I'm going to be using in this video is by using a library called Axios. So if you want to install it, you just come over here and say npm install Axios, or something like this, or it just depends on where you're doing this, where you're using this. But Axios is a very famous library which allows you to fetch data from an API. So you can see over here, I said axios.get and I put the URL for the API. The reason why I did this is because I want to get the data that is returned from this API. However, how do we do this in a way such that we tell our JavaScript code to wait till the data has been received from the API request to then do something? So I technically want to just, for example, console log the data, right? Now, if I do something like this, I say const data equals to axios.get. If you are not familiar with the idea of promises and async await, you might think that if I console log over here data, it should work. But look what happens when I do this. When I come over here and run my application, you should see that it returned a promise and it says that the status is pending. The reason for that is because what this returns over here and any other method of fetching data, it will always return the same thing, which is a promise. And as we talked previously, a promise isn't a value. A promise is almost like an object, a class, where you can find different aspects of that value of the class by either trying to see what happens when this succeeds and trying to see what happens when it fails. So what I mean by that is basically, if I really want to get this data, I need to resolve the promise by saying something like data dot then. So like after this data has been received, we want to run this function over here. And this will only occur when the data finally comes from the API. Now, if we want to catch any errors, I can also just say data, can just put like dot catch over here and catch any errors that occur. Now, most of the libraries, they already have built-in, they already in the promise that they are returning, they already include arguments to the dot then and to the dot catch. So whenever you fetch data, the data will be responded over here. And you can just grab the data by grabbing the arguments of the function when the promise resolves, when the promise succeeds. And the same thing goes for the error. I can catch any error and grab the error by using this over here. Now, what I can do is I can console log over here saying just the data. I just want to console log the data if we receive it. And if there's any errors, I want to console log the error like this. Now, if I remove this, you should see that now if I run this application by just coming over here and running it, what should happen is we should get a list of data. And you see that it kind of took like a little bit, right, to run it. Actually, we didn't get a list of the data because we're console logging this over here, which is, oh, I console log the data instead. I want to console log the res. So let me just do this again. You should see that we actually get a bunch of information related to the request. If we want to access the data that was returned from the API, I can say something like res.data, and you can see that we actually get the data that was responded, right? You can see we get a bunch of facts about cats. But the important thing is that we're actually being able to fetch data from an API and see it in our application. Now, what if there's an error, right? For example, imagine I forget to put the S over here. It will definitely cause an error because this over here shouldn't be. Actually, I'll just write random words. This API doesn't have this endpoint. So what happens in this case? Well, let's run it again. And you can see that this was caught, right? It said, it gave us an error. It's just saying that it wasn't able to get the data that we were requesting. So it means that the promise is successfully like dealing with everything. And if I also want to put a finally case over here, I can say finally, and I can say something like promise, like console.log, promise resolved, right? And this should work perfectly. Now, what is the point of this, right? The point is that we're able to tell our application to wait for something to happen to then continue moving forward. We're waiting for the data to be returned so that we can continue doing something with the data, maybe manipulating it, maybe displaying it in our screen, whatever we want. And promises is a great way to do this. Now, there's a different way to do this, which was introduced a little bit later in the JavaScript journey or timeline, which is using Async Await. And I don't want to debate on which one is better. They're different in many ways. I do think that Async Await makes code look cleaner, and I think many people would agree with that. But basically, Async Await is just synthetic sugar in the sense that it is doing the same thing, but it's decreasing the amount that you need to write to make the exact same thing happen. And the way you use Async Await to do something like this, it's pretty simple. Well, the first thing you need is a function. You need to make a function because Async Await only works when you create a function that is declared as asynchronous. So for example, if I create a function over here called get or fetch data, like this, and this function, all it does is it just makes the API request and it returns back the data, right? Or console logs the data. Well, what I do is I put this logic inside of here, and instead of saying .then, .catch, all the other stuff that I mentioned before, we just make this function async by putting async keyword over here right before the parentheses. And if you're using like normal JavaScript without the arrow function syntax, you can just say function, the name of the function, like fetch data, like this, and you put the async right over here. So you say async right over here, and this function should now be an asynchronous function. Well, both of them do the exact same thing, but the important thing is that we have this fetch data function that is now asynchronous. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to, first of all, fix this URL over here because it is clearly not working because we changed it. So the correct API endpoint is /facts, and I just realized I also accidentally put an S over here, so we can just remove it, and this is the correct endpoint to make our request. Now, if I came over here and I said console.log data, what do you think would happen? Well, we made this function asynchronous, and we're making the API request, but what exactly will this console log? Because we're just made the function asynchronous, and we don't have a .then, we don't have a .catch. How would this work? Well, let's try it. If I came over here and I call the fetch data function, and we ran this again, you see that it console logs something, but it console logs a promise that is pending, meaning that we didn't resolve the actual promise. We need a .then or a .catch to resolve the promise. But that's counterintuitive because I just told you that async await is a replacement for promises. We are using the .then .catch syntax. Well, that's true. One thing that we need to do to make it so that it will work is the fact that every function which is asynchronous will do nothing if there isn't something inside of the function telling it to wait. So the await over here just means that whenever you have something in your function which returns a promise, you should put the await after the equal sign. So like I said that I want to declare the variable data to be equal to await whatever promise this returns. And now this over here will wait for the promise to be resolved and then console log the data. So if I actually come over here and I console log this again, you should see that it is actually console logging whatever was returned in a .then, which means it is doing the exact same thing but without the whole like a bunch of code writing .then, .catch, and .finally. So you might be wondering now, okay, this fixes the issue where we can, in a single line of code, we now can say .then and get the actual result. But how do we error handle in this case? Because in using promises, we just say .catch and it easily catches the errors and nothing happens. Well, to error handle when you're using async await, you need to use the classic try catch method. So we'll try to do this over here. If it succeeds, then it succeeds. Perfect. But if it fails and there was any errors in the network request, then we can catch an error and the error will be passed over here as an argument. So I can just console log this error. And you'll see that if I come over here and I again screw up the URL and I run this again, it should now console log an error and not the actual like request, because like it was an error, so it didn't pass through this. It tried this, it failed, and then it catched the error. Now the last thing you guys might be wondering is how do we use the finally, like .finally property that we had with normal promises, or with the notation that I showed you guys in the beginning. Well, this is interesting. In JavaScript, you can also just come over here and write finally and put a case for finally. And you can just console log something like hello. Now, you might argue that this over here is the same size as the .then, .catch, and like what I showed previously. Well, sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. Both do the exact same thing, so I wouldn't be too caught up about like which one to choose. Depends on each situation. For example, if you like, technically, I would say that async await looks better, but it just looks better. You know what I mean, right? I don't like having callback functions. I don't like having to say .then, .catch, and I just prefer this syntax. But you can choose whichever one you want and use it in your project. And now you probably know how asynchronous programming works in JavaScript. Now, this is a concept that is very useful and very important throughout many languages. So I really hope you guys gained value from this video. And if you liked the video, leave a like down below, comment what you want to see next, subscribe because I'm posting 2 to 3 times a week, and I would massively appreciate if you guys could support the channel. Don't forget to check out the sponsor of the video. The link will be in the description. Thank you, Ladder, for sponsoring this video. And I'm really thankful for everyone who watched the video as well. So that's basically it. Leave a like, subscribe, and I see you guys next time.